All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we're going to talk one more piece of what some bacteria are able to do to sort of protect their genetic information when conditions are far less than optimal. And that's this idea of certain bacterial species capable of producing these things called endospores. Um, and really, endospores are just this thick protective coat that bacterial cells will create around their genetic information that can survive some seriously harsh conditions. It's only going to protect the DNA, however. The rest of the cell is going to kind of dehydrate, disintegrate, um, fall prey to whatever those genetic, or excuse me, those environmental conditions are that aren't allowing that bacterial cell to continue to survive and thrive, as a result, pushing it into producing an endospore in the first place. Um, so this is essentially what happens. So the bacterial chromosome will reproduce, will go through DNA replication, create a copy of itself. And then it's going to wall off that bacterial chromosome into this sort of corner, produce these thick membranes around it, form a peptidoglycan layer around it, coat it again, for spore coat, and then sort of release that endospore out to the environment, while in the process the rest of that cell is just falling prey to terrible environmental conditions. Interesting thing about endospores is that they are often in species that cause disease to some types of organisms. We find them the biggest problem to ones that cause disease in us. Um, because they are so durable, they can actually survive just typical boiling of water. Um, so when we look at most bacterial species and we know there's contaminated water, one of the first things that we recommend is to boil it because that kills most um, problematic species for us. But endospores can survive that. So, in order to be able to kill off an endospore, remove those endospore species, not only do you need to heat it up, you need to heat it up quite hot. So, boiling water, remember, is 100 degrees Celsius. We're talking heating it with steam at 121 degrees Celsius. But it's not only that increase in 21 degrees, it's also needing to be done at high pressure. So when you look at things like autoclaves, part of their job is to not only heat things at a very high temperature, but also to do it under pressure to truly achieve sterilization. So that is one way to do it, is to put things into an autoclave, and that'll do it. So think of it's basically a pressure cooker, right? Heating things up really high under pressure. Other way to do it is also to irradiate it. So if you ever pay attention to any of the things that I hand you in the lab that are sterilized, it's usually been done by one of those two processes. Either it's been irradiated um, or it has been autoclaved. Crazy thing about endospores is that they can remain dormant in natural environments for centuries. Those endospores can just hang out until conditions become favorable again, whether that means water, nutrients, some combination thereof. They get cues from the environment when those conditions become favorable again that allows that sort of endospore coat to break down, rehydrate. Once that genetic material is there again, they are then capable of resuming metabolism and they start growing again and start reproducing. So if you ever come across the story of the mummy's curse, this is a result of what was happening in the early 1900s as archaeologists, mostly British archaeologists, were going into Egypt and trying to excavate the tombs of pharaohs. And of course, these archaeologists are generally college educated, they've got some money, they've got funding probably from wealthy backers. And so it wasn't the archaeologists necessarily who were going in and doing all the hard labor of digging out the tunnels. Um, Instead, they were sending in men mostly, um, into these places who would have been of a lower social class. Interesting thing is that these men, and occasionally an archaeologist as well, um, started dying from mysterious illnesses that nobody seemed to be able to understand. Nobody had seen. The symptoms didn't make sense. They didn't know how to help these people. And if they weren't dying, they certainly were at least becoming very sick. And so this sort of myth appeared as a result of that, that they were basically pissing off the old pharaohs that they were in there excavating and were dying as a result. Um, that's sort of where the myth came from of the mummy's curse. What we think more likely was the case was that there were diseases in those tombs, in surfaces, in the mummies themselves, perhaps, in the materials that were left behind, um, in their canopic jars, and so on and so forth, that were capable of going through and producing endospores. So the second they excavated these tombs and allowed them access to light and humidity and oxygen, those species started coming out of their endospore state and becoming vegetative again, meaning that they were capable of reproducing, which also meant they were capable of infecting. And so they think perhaps it was what was the cause of those strange illnesses that were popping up in these excavation teams, because they were unearthing diseases that humans hadn't come in contact with for generations, as a result of endospore species that were present in those tombs. So, kind of an interesting idea.